So what I wanted to do was show a real demo of something that I created this morning, and I hope it works. So what I will be doing is I have a Jira system that we use internally. So I'm going to be creating a ticket. And what I want to do with that is when I create the ticket, it will invoke a Fission function. That Fission function will do two things. It will actually tell me on Slack, which we use as a rudimentary alerting system in some cases, saying that, hey, something arrived. B, it will actually call Platform9 APIs to create a tenant. So when you saw our dashboard, you can create multiple tenants in our system so that you can have a QA organization or an R&D organization or an IT organization, finance organization, so on and so forth. So imagine a system where you're creating a ticket and say, I want to do this, and it will automatically do it. It will automatically do it for you. Now, since it's a demo, I just hacked up something. So it's not going to be real, but it will give you a flavor of what we can achieve with these kind of functionality. So let me get into that. So this is the Jira system that I have. And look at this. I can create a new webhook. So what I'm going to be doing is, before I create the webhook, I'm going to show you the function and how to set that up. How do you go to the next? Thank you. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this. So what I already have is, I have a function in this Python file which will go and connect to which will send a Slack message on the top. It will also authenticate, and it will create a tenant. So those are the three functions. Internal it will drive. The main function is just going to call authenticate, then create a tenant, and then send a Slack message. So that's what it's going to do. Okay. And what I'm going to do next is I've already set up the Fission binary on this machine. So I'm just going to be referencing my nodes and copying, pasting how to create. First, I will create the function, and I will attach it to a trigger. In this case, it would be an HTTP request. So Jira will send an HTTP request to Fission function. That's what I'm going to show you. And then it will send the Slack message as well as the create the tenant. So Fission function create tenant environment code tenant.py. So I'm just going to be doing this.
And is Fission a separate container? Waiting for that?
That's correct. And I can show that to you before we invoke. I will show that to you as well. Create. So this is how, okay, sorry. I need to specify what environment that I'm using. In this case, I'm just using a Python environment, which already contains the Python runtime, and because it's going to be running my Python script. So I just created the function, but it's actually useless unless and until I tie it to a trigger. And the trigger would be Fission, what we call as route, create. You need to specify the URL and the function that is associated with it. So it would be a post request that would be coming from Jira to the Fission function. And function, we are referencing the function that we just created. Okay. So now with Fission, we have the function. The tenant function is there. And if I look for route, a route to that function would be there too. So we have /tenant, which will go to that. Now, what I'm going to do next is if you look at this particular, and I'm going to be connecting to this. Is this the one? No. Yeah. Sorry. So it only has one tenant right now. What I'm going to be doing next is first create a webhook to point to the Fission route that I just created. I will just copy and paste from an existing test that I was doing. Let's say create a new webhook. Let's call it the CFD demo. And it will go to, instead of /slacker, it will go to /tenant because that's the route that we chose. And I'm just going to restrict it to myself, otherwise we will be bombarded with the requests. So I will say assignee equals to my name. Okay. And only when it's created, call the Fission function. And that's it. So now everything's set up. We have set up the Jira to talk to the Fission function. We have created the Fission function, which will call our APIs to create the tenant, and it will also send a Slack message. Can you open up the Slack and go to CFD 2017 test? Sure. Sorry, I forgot to ask about that.
Oops.
I will
Just ignore everything else.
Yes, I will. No, not this one.
Man, K.
CFD 2017 test.
Test. Okay.
Fine. Okay. What I also done is, if I can go to next. Okay. What I've also done is in that code, you have to specify a magic word again because I don't want every ticket that is assigned to me to create a tenant on that. I have to specify a magic word so that it can create that tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and create a ticket. So assign it to myself, assign it to Rupak. And the summary name would be the one that would create it as a tenant. So let's say CFD 2017 test. And the magic word is, please create my tenant abracadabra. Okay? And I just want to make sure if there are any required fields, I will put it. This is completely not required. Okay, so I'm just going to push that button. It will create the ticket, and hopefully we can switch to the service tenant and this tenant view and see if the CFD 2017 test was created. It was created. And let's also check Slack to see if the message appeared. Please create my tenant. Appeared here. It appeared twice, so it looks like I have a bug in my code. So that's the power of Fission. Very simply, write some functions, and you can glue a lot of things together. That's not it. There are others, but this is one that I thought was very useful, at least in our experience.
I mean, just on that example, I mean, other people have mentioned that you can obviously link Jira and Slack together directly. You don't need Fission functions. So for this example, you're contriving an example to
That's right.
to show the point. But I mean, obviously, it's a big, bold move when serverless is so new, is to come out with a new open source initiative. What are your thoughts on OpenWhisk? Because that's obviously started by IBM, that little small company, and taken on by Red Hat, that other small open source company. Your thoughts on that?
So OpenWhisk is interesting, but I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to focus on the IBM's Bluemix specifically. If you look at serverless is just about writing the small piece of code. So yes, there is a framework which is interesting, But what makes it more interesting are the services around it. Like you mentioned, you need S3 bucket, you need that event bus so that others can participate on it. What we see is that Kubernetes would be that ecosystem where others would produce these events, those services would be there, and hence it would be useful to have a serverless framework. So Bluemix is great, but until unless it's on Kubernetes with every other vendor participating in it, it won't, and even Fission won't be successful. So for it to be successful, it has to be open source, to be working on a particular framework, and we chose Kubernetes. OpenWhisk, I probably chose Bluemix. I think they may be successful over there, but I think from where we stand, the way we see the world, Kubernetes is going to be the way you would be running workloads, at least for your microservices workloads, on different public clouds, private clouds, and that's where it becomes interesting.
So you're thinking that that's the key differentiator, that because Fission is running on top of Kubernetes and Kubernetes is becoming universal, other than Amazon, that's where you see your differentiator, that this could have more traction.
Yeah.
But also you did say in the beginning that Fission's just a pluggable something, so that could be swapped out for OpenWhisk or other serverless frameworks if they were.
Hopefully not.
Fair enough, yeah.
But yeah, as I said, we believe in open source, we believe in ecosystems, and this is the way I think everyone will come together.
And so when you talked about things that might be more complex, and I totally get why demos aren't complex, but what do you kind of envision? Like what sort of, I looked at the examples that are available, like those don't seem to be that complex either yet. Maybe there's something to contribute, but like what are you thinking? What sort of complexity or what sort of functions might people do?
So I actually have an example that I play around with in my own spare time.
You have spare time?
Yeah, well,
That's,
it's
you
a
shouldn't
loose
say that,
definition
yeah.
of spare time.
Awake time?
Exactly. I've been playing around with Fission itself because we talked about how it ties into the Kubernetes bus, and we talk about how our customers are enterprises. A lot of enterprises care about build back, show back capabilities. The Kubernetes bus has these event capabilities that show creations and deletions. Having the ability for Fission to act on those events and then update your backend, essentially complex costing table. So I've had pods, I had a number of pods, say 5, and it was created at X time, was deleted at X time, or it was scaled at X time. Being able to track those events and calculate build back, show back capability for an enterprise just on a Kubernetes or microservices framework is something that doesn't really exist out there today. Okay. So it's just a demo I play around with. But even to the extent of this one, we have customers today that leverage Jira ticket flows for approvals into to get access to a tenant in OpenStack. And this gives them the capability to, upon approval, create a tenant, add a user, set a quota for them within their tenant without any outside intervention. Okay. Yeah, and then we're also working with a third customer where we're leveraging things like Fission to integrate with their CMDB. So actually, I think you guys were at ServiceNow earlier, leveraging Fission to actually make those injections into ServiceNow. So a glue now between your infrastructure layer and all of your management tools that hover around it, whether that's CMDB, any sort of DNS framework, whatever that may be. So there's a lot of opportunities, especially even in the infrastructure place.
Are you seeing, so the examples we've used is very much sort of IT operations kind of thing. So
Yes.
on two aspects, one ServiceNow ticketing, but another thing that you need to turn on and off a VM, or you need to tag some things in AWS. I'm just thinking of the infrastructure operational examples. But in a way, nobody really cares about that. Businesses aren't set up to manage their IT. That people are going to see the future as serverless as writing business applications that are literally going to make money for the company. Is anyone delving into that yet with Fission?
I'm just trying to think if there are any business applications. We have seen a lot of work on the DevOps side, but we do think some simple applications can be easily built with Fission. I don't have that demo available right now, but we have a demo for a simple guestbook application that you can write. Simple IT applications would be another one, where you do not need very complex functionality, but all you need to do is have APIs, go to the database, push it there, and that's about it, or query from the database.
And I think that's where the real power lies as well. It gives you a quick starter API that you can scale as you need. So I, being a small business, want to embrace a service style framework for my applications or for my data. And I know I have a customer database, or I know I have a finance database that I need to start to expose. I can leverage something like Fission to throw an endpoint in front of it and start to do expose small pieces of it and grow that over time, rather than having to version large amounts of API code and run services around those as well. I can start to just expose that one chunk at a time. I can just do a get customers and start to expose a customer list right off the bat.
But Julian, was your question more about what people are actually doing, or asking the possibility of what people could do? Because those are two different things, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one would lead into the other. Of the whole point of serverless is to get rid of servers, to get rid of managing IT infrastructure. So step one is using serverless to manage IT infrastructure, but ideally you want to get rid of that IT infrastructure and write business apps natively in something like serverless. So all that infrastructure that you've loved, cared for, and fed in OpenStack and Kubernetes just gets retired.
But at the same time, I would argue that Jira is actually your business infrastructure rather than IT infrastructure. Just to show that as an example, I'm sure there are hundreds of other examples that I cannot think of one right now, where you're essentially integrating applications. You're not talking about infrastructure at all.
And like you mentioned, it does start at that infrastructure alerting type of level. But my team personally uses a lot of this to tie together. Knowing the world of customer success or working with customers, you have customer data spread out across all of your businesses, right? Nobody has a single great CRM that has everything within it. You know, Salesforce is out there, but you probably have usage data somewhere. You probably have billing data somewhere. I actually am using Fission to expose APIs across these to pull together information into dashboards. So starting to tie business application layers together through webhooks in Fission.
Yeah, it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out, whether people are going to be writing serverless applications or they're going to be natively with ServiceNow, as you mentioned, and also with Benioff's Salesforce. Yeah, are you going to write your business applications in something like ServiceNow or in something like Fission? Yeah, and it's an interesting future.
But going back to Jeremy's point, I don't think any one of them will be ever enough. So you will need to transfer the data, make available through another set of dashboards. And that's where I think Fission would be very, very powerful.
Until you see the one global conglomerate that eats the rest of the world and offers all the functionality that everybody needs in one application.
Isn't that AWS? They're trying.
You're still going to need those glue pieces between your applications.
You have an interesting pitch that you can use basically serverless across, any cloud platform, right?
That's essentially what we're going for.
But I think in my head, I'm trying to justify to do serverless, I have to set up some servers and things. Whereas if I just went to Lambda, all I need to have is code to get started, right? Now, obviously, you only have to do this one time, and then once it's set up and everything, you can just provide your code.
And that's where Platform9 comes in with our managed service offerings today. You can go out to AWS and do a one-click deploy of a Kubernetes cluster that will manage for you, watch the uptime, et cetera. It's available, and you have the ability to deploy Fission right on top of that. So now you have your own little function as a service cloud, and locked down to you or kept publicly open, and if you wanted to do it that way. So that's kind of where Platform9 is inserting ourselves into that game.
And again, going back to Jeremy's point, this is all open. This is not, Platform9 is the only one that's offering right now because it's in early stages, but you will see others adopting it. It will become part of the Kubernetes, for example.
The example that was just given, though, you'd have to have container infrastructure available to run that. So you're going to have to pay for that whether you're using it or not. So if you're using it for other things, great. Just spin up another container quick, run your code, and kill it.
Yep.
If not, if you don't already have a container infrastructure for something else or you don't have a use case for it in the cloud, it's cheaper to just run it.
Yep. And it definitely has, benefits and detriments on both sides, right? Because you talk Fission, you're locked now into AWS, and if you're locked into AWS, what if they hike their price in 3 years? Who knows where that path actually goes? And that's why we're big proponents of that open ecosystem. The ability to choose what you want, having a framework for every tier and allowing the developers to choose and run whatever they want.
So how, I don't want to come across as negative, but how defensive is this as a vision when OpenStack was started as everyone else wants to bandy and go against VMware, and then Kubernetes has started as, well, we want to manage containers, but we don't want to go with Docker Enterprise Edition. Fission and any other serverless is also, everyone wants to go against Amazon. Historically, those defensive moves haven't played out because they just haven't. So what do you think of the serverless?
So if you look at AWS and if you look at Docker use, you will see a lot, I don't have the exact percentage, but a lot of those virtual machines are running containers, which tells me that people really want to use containers specifically to hide the underlying infrastructure. And if that is true, then Kubernetes Fission is going to be definitely successful, along with the IaaS layer, which is open source. So I completely believe in that. The Docker containers and Kubernetes and Fission on top of it, I think that would be the infrastructure that you will use for your applications, definitely.
And to kind of answer your question at another level, I think you can look at some of it as defensive, but it's not entirely a defensive move, right? The open source movement isn't defensive in general. It's about being more open, having more ability to customize, about having capabilities at your fingertips and growing as a community. And you've already seen companies out there that have made open source models work, Red Hat being one of those largest ones. But if you look at the way the world is moving, you look at Google, you look at Facebook, you look at Microsoft, they're moving more and more to a inner source, open source type of movement. They have their core code. They're open sourcing more of the things that they used to hold dear because a lot of the world is moving to an open source methodology. So it's not entirely defensive. It's more about growing and sharing as an ecosystem. Because I spent time in security at GE. Look at encryption frameworks as a start. You don't want to go out and just take a privately developed encryption framework because it hasn't had all of the eyes on it that some of the open source frameworks have today. They've been hammered by a number of people in that community and hardened over time. Whereas if you go with that closed source encryption code, all you're counting on is that the people in that company are bright enough and sound enough to have done everything that the rest of the world has done in the open.
Going back to the ecosystem, I think if you go with a public cloud provider, they can only offer you a few things. They will not be able to grow that ecosystem of services that you will see with open source. So going back to the applications example that we were talking about earlier, Mongo database as a service, I'm pretty sure you have developers in your companies who will say, no, I need this database. I need cockroach database, for example. And AWS will not be providing that as a service. You will need to come up an answer on how to run it and how to run it on multiple infrastructure. Because frankly, with AWS, the cost will go high at some point of time. And you will think about going to other places. And if you lock yourself into one place, you won't be able to move out.
Question that I still have after all of this. Who are you selling to?
In terms of our customers?
Yes.
Or in terms of the role of the person who I'm selling?
In terms of Platform9, who do you envisage will buy your stuff?
So in terms of the customers, as Jeremy pointed out, we have a large footprint in high tech, media, as well as insurance now.
The industry verticals, yeah. But who within those organizations are you talking to?
So we are talking to both IT and engineering, depending upon the product. So on OpenStack side, it's mostly IT, directors of IT, CIOs, VPs at that level. On the Kubernetes side, we are also seeing a lot of traction with CTO organization, engineering organizations as well.
Okay. And is that, it sounds like that's more of an operations focus rather than, say, developers in IT.
Well, I think microservices is still more developer focused. So on the container side, it is developer focused.
Right, but for what you're selling, do you go in and talk to the developers and say, we'll give you managed Kubernetes, or are you selling that to the people who are running operations to say we can give you some Kubernetes for your developers to then consume?
So it's actually very interesting. In our sales cycle, what you see is we continue to go up the stack. We're actually permeating multiple tiers of the business. So we have developers that are seeing us, downloading white papers, experiencing our sandbox experience, and then starting to talk to their directors to bring us in. And then we see the IT and the operations staff saying, we need to do something to keep up and to stop, this IT creep out into the public cloud, because we have a mandate to maintain a certain footprint or a certain cost control. And so we're kind of pulling both sides of these spheres together and up and down the chain as well. So they all come in at different sections of our offer.
So to answer your questions more specifically, ultimately you're right, it would be the operations team who holds the budget. But to Jeremy's point, there are a lot of influence that comes from the engineering side as well, especially on the containers and microservices side.
Okay.
How do you then get into businesses if you're focusing on the IT side, but a CIO says, or even a CEO says, I want to write a new business application, which serverless could be a fit for, but now you're used to talking to the IT part. The CEO is saying, I've heard this cloud thing, is talking about Amazon. Amazon is saying, yeah, we can do it all in Lambda functions. You don't need to worry about any infrastructure. They hear about Platform9 from the IT, they talk to them. But that's a very different conversation about application development at a serverless level rather than managing infrastructure.
That's not a conversation they have.
Yeah.
That's absolutely not a conversation they have. The conversation they have is, help me understand how this is going to increase revenue, how this is going to create stickier relationships with my customers. They're having very business-centric conversations. It's not about serverless. It's not about technology. There are some exceptions where boards and CEOs are now having mandates to, we need to be more cloud-focused. But I think that's really an anomaly, but they really don't even know what that means. They just use it as a mandate, and that's the end of it. So I would caution that I don't see this conversation happening at all, even with a CIO. That's just, they're going in the opposite direction toward business conversations, not driving more into technology conversations at all.
They would bring it
This
up
is
if
way-
they heard something from their staffs. My staff keeps talking about this Kubernetes thing and how it can really change my availability, uptime, exposure back to my customer. So they're still elevating it up to how am I maintaining a SLA or a business-driven metric to a customer, but they may mention a technology because somebody's bubbled it up to.
So I will argue that number one, that is what I would consider to be a traditional CIO as opposed to a transformational CIO. The second thing is an SLA is not a business metric, period. It's not. It's a technology metric. 99% uptime. How does that translate to business? It doesn't.
No, I agree.
Right? I think you have to be real careful about when you throw those terms around, because when you go in to have a conversation with a transformational CIO and you do start to talk the way you are, you're going to lose them very quickly, and they're going to go, okay, you're just throwing buzzwords out, we're done.
Right, but that's the thing with a transformational CIO, it's an entirely different conversation. They get you out of the gate because they're talking at a higher level, at a more cloud-centric level is probably the way to put it. You don't have to convince them that transformation is needed. They're already there. They're already talking about a different level.
So I think we may have to agree to disagree, because a transformational CIO is not talking about this.
They're talking transformationally, but business transformation.
Yeah, but business transformation, not technology.
And that's what I'm saying, they're not talking
But
technology.
ultimately, it will relate to a business value. It can relate to the saving the cost, or they can relate to how their application, which was not keeping up before, is able to keep up. Either one of them. So ultimately, it will be a business relationship. It will be a business conversation. And that's where it will boil down to.
I think that's an interesting viewpoint that comes from an engineering-led vendor organization which sees the IT being the IT being the solution to all the problems, which it may well be, while the CEO just wants to sell more widgets, and IT must make it happen, and the CIO and the CTO are going to have to fight it out whether they're going to go cloud or Platform9, or they're going to buy vBlocks for their data center. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think how, because your business is IT, but widget selling is not IT, it's widgets.
So coming back to the open source, and this is why it's really important for us and everybody else to talk about open source, because that's where developers, like you said, they heard about, we are not selling it to them, but they heard about Fission, they heard about Kubernetes, they know what it is. When it comes to CIOs or director of ITs, they say, okay, now I have to do this. Where do I go? And that's where we come in. So we are influencing on the development side, but on the IT side, that's where we are selling, because we provide the whole managed service aspect of it. So we are truly providing it as a service.
You've got to tie into a lot of organizations in an enterprise, because you could talk to the infrastructure people at the VM level for OpenStack, the cloud native application developers, plus the other developers who are doing Fission. So yeah, that's just different conversations for different groups, which is expected.
Correct. So, but
all
on
at
one,
the IT level, yeah.
Yeah, but on one side, it's more influencing. They already know about Kubernetes. They already know about Fission. And we are saying, okay, we will be able to manage it and give it to you as a service, because you don't have time to manage it. We will do it for you.
Yeah, I suppose if they've already decided they're even using the word containers, let alone Kubernetes, they're pretty far down the track.
There are so many steps between containers and business outcomes.
Absolutely,
I mean, that's not a step or two. I mean, you're talking several steps to make those connections. And to suggest that they're very close together, I think, is not understanding what we're talking about in terms of business outcomes.
I would disagree with you on that perspective, because we do see when we go talk to CIOs, they understand some of this, not all of it. I do agree with that. They understand the business problems associated with it, and say, look, if you do this, if your director of engineering is saying, or if your director of operations is saying, look, we need to buy this product because this is what it will give you, and hence it will save you on cost, or save you on time, or will make your application more resilient, because that's what you are looking at.